What's up, YouTube? Welcome to a very special video here on our channel. I'm Lord Tupper. I'm joined by the one and only Mr. Metronome, and we're here with a June 1st, 2020 banned and restricted announcement here. I think the first ever to have impacted Limited. Ben, is that correct?
I think so. It's pretty insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we've only got a few more weeks of Ikoria, but as evidenced by, I think, Twitter and my Twitch chat yesterday, people are really curious about how this companion update is going to affect Limited. So we wanted to come out with a special emergency video here to talk about that. So we're going to start off by reading the companion rule, and then we're going to talk about all 10 companions and maybe what the implications are for those cards. So first up here, new companion rule, announcement date June 1st, 2020. Once per game, anytime you could cast a sorcery during your main phase when the stack is empty, you can pay 3 generic mana to put your companion from your sideboard into your hand. This is a special action, not an activated ability, right? So you can't like interact with it at all or, respond to it or anything like that.
No stifling.
Yeah, no stifling that. Not that that really exists in Ikoria for us here. So, okay, so now there's a pretty big tax to companions, right? Before there was this, like, they're very free. We recently started talking about them in a term that Kyle Rose, aka Ham TV, had put in, which is like, if you're thinking about companioning or not, think about like, would you mulligan to shuffle a couple cards into your library? And that sort of puts it in perspective of like, no, I wouldn't do that. I would just like to have an 8-card hand. So now we have a pretty big impact. It's now no longer free, Ben. Any initial big sweeping thoughts about this additional cost of 3 mana?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I think it's going to really hurt the ones that were not good before, or the ones that you were sort of on the fence about companioning. And I think the ones at the top are still pretty good and probably worth going after. And I think it's probably also a little awkward with the ones like, there were times where you got one in pack 2 or you got one in pack 3 and you were like really scrambling, but it was busted enough that like that companion, like Garuda, for example, could maybe carry like Garuda in a pile. Don't know if that's the case anymore. Like if you're going to be doing that, like where you hard pivot in pack 2 or pack 3.
Yeah, I think that's really true. So let's talk about, perhaps let's start with maybe the ones we think are least impacted or still worth going for. So again, like we did on our episode on companions, we didn't really rank them 1 through 10, sort of put them into tiers instead. And so we have least impacted here, and we have 3, maybe 2, and then a questionable one here. So we're looking at Garuda, Lurrus, and Obosh. Let's start with your first example here. Garuda, Doom of Depths. This is the 6 mana 6/6, even CMC being the companion clause. Why does this seem least impacted to you?
Well, I think, there's a pretty easy play pattern. Garuda is all evens, right? Where you're going to go 2-drop, ideally. On 3, you'll pay 3 to put Garuda in your hand, and then you're just playing the game like normal from there, right?
Right.
So it slots in pretty well into the natural curve of Garuda, but also Garuda's just raw power, right? So if you're behind, like Garuda does a great job of catching you up after you got behind from paying 3 mana to do nothing.
Yeah, I think Garuda still seems like one of those ones that can get out of jail free or a bail you out of jail kind of card if your draft isn't going super well and you see it in pack 2 or maybe pack 3. And I still think is going to be something I'm going to try and hard force pack 1, pick 1. And I think the same goes for Lurrus of the Dream Den. This is the 3 mana 3/2 lifelink, the companion clause being only spells or permanents in your deck have to be 2 CMC or less. So this also seems like, this actually seems like kind of a slightly higher cost, because the play pattern previously of Lurrus was probably on turn 4 or 5, play Lurrus, rebuy something. You don't quite have that flexibility or that cheapness, right? You're going to go like 1-drop, 2-drop, and then maybe on turn 3 you put Lurrus into your hand, so you're going to take a turn off, but you sort of maybe make up for that with the fact that you've already affected the board with a couple of cheap plays.
Right, I think the paying 3 is such a less of a cost because everything in your deck costs 1 or 2 that's a permanent, right? So the curve is just naturally so much lower, you're going to be able to slot it in. And there's also a lot of times the play pattern with Lurrus was just like, wait, and this is going to be the last card I cast after my opponent has burned all their removal,
right?
And then I'm going to win the game. So, yeah. I mean, that play pattern is still very much intact, and the 3 mana is almost negligible in that scenario.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then the last on our least impacted list here, we just sort of made a swap in our pre-show discussion, is Obosh, the Prey Piercer. So this is the 5 mana 3/5, companion clause being odd CMC cards in your deck only. So the play pattern previously, or ideally I think with Obosh, was 1-drop, 3-drop, Maybe, hopefully, on turn 4, you get to go 1-drop, 3-drop, and then turn 5, slam Obosh, serve with the team. You won't be able to do that here, and it seems pretty costly to go 1-drop, maybe 1-drop on turn 2, and then turn 3, put Obosh into your hand. I could see that being a play pattern sometimes. But you talked about perhaps another play pattern that might happen.
Yeah, I think there's a world where you're going to wait longer to cast Obosh, similar like you would with Luris, and it'll actually allow you to build up a more threatening board as well. But wait until you got 6 mana, double spell with a 3-drop and paying 3 to push, put Obosh into your hand, and then next turn after that you'll be able to cast Obosh. Like the mana costs don't have to line up perfectly, right? Like that's not how games of Magic play out. But that is a very nice setup if you can manage to do Obosh when you've got 6 mana.
Yeah, I agree. So I think those 3 are still going to be top of the heap here. And so now moving...
Another... Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Another way to maybe frame this is that... Another way to maybe frame this is that you think about it as like paying 3 to sort of cast Divination or something, except one of the cards you're drawing is a bomb, right? Like... Because divination, like its function is to put you up a card, right? But then the card that you're going to be up a card at the end of this. Like that's sort of a way to maybe frame, like if you're having a hard time conceptualizing how much it's going to impact these cards, like that's maybe a way to think about it.
And so this is I think that's a really great way to frame it. I hadn't thought of that at all. So then are you thinking about like, in the context of Ikoria Limited, is divination a good card? Like Dark Bargain, I think, is not a good card. And that costs 4, and it deals you 2 damage, so there's that. Is Divination a good card? Is Of One Mind just on its own a good card in Ikoria?
I mean, it's a fine card, but it's also a free card you're getting to start with in your hand, right?
Yes.
It's like you start the game with the ability to cast, like you start with an 8th Divination in your hand to get a very good card in your deck, which I do think is still really powerful, yes.
I agree. So then with that in mind, moving on to the ones that we think are more impacted. So we're still high on Luris, Obosh, and Garuda. Now let's look at Lutree the Spell Chaser. You were talking about how you're not super high on Lutree just in general. Maybe you've come down a little bit on Lutree. It's funny, I think our discussion from our companion episode you talking about it put me higher on the card than I think now than you are. But it is tough because I think again, thinking about the play patterns with Lutree, there were times when you would just want to flash it in as a 3-mana 3/2. Which you now no longer can do, right? You would have had to have set that up already. And I think we're going to see that among all of the 3 CMC, other than Luris, all of the 3 CMC companions are pretty impacted in that way because you can't just go, hey, on turn 3, I get to play this, just as a free 8th card. You no longer can do that. Then there was some flexibility you had with Lutree sometimes where, you would, let's say you're holding up a 4-mana instant, but you've also got a Fire Prophecy. And so you've got this flexibility of, well, I'd really like to play this 4-mana spell, but if I want to or if I need to cast Fire Prophecy and copy it, I have that option. Again, you don't have that unless you've already on a previous turn paid the 3 mana to put Lutree into your hand. And so that also leaves, your opponent has this sort of buffer of, I know they can't copy anything yet, right? I know that nothing crazy is going to happen yet. So all of that, I think, bumps Lutree down from where I previously had it in the top tier, really want to make it work card. I now don't have it there anymore.
Right, yeah, I think everything you said is true. And I think just in general, the deck building cost of Lutree, I think, was pretty steep. Steeper than I wanted to admit at the time. I mean, can you end up with very good Lutree decks? Yes. Does it start from pack 1, pick 1? Almost always. That's not even necessarily true. There were times you opened a pack 2, pick 1 Lutree, and it was pretty easy to go from there.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, I think the even more serious cost that's not immediately apparent when you're doing the Lutree thing is that your deck's a lot less cohesive, right? It's generally less synergistic to have one of a bunch of things. It's hard to get powerful synergies. You were much more of a control deck that was really relying on Lutree. And I think, similar to what you said, you lose a lot of flexibility. There were a lot of times to win those games with Lutree Companion that I needed to hit Lutree in a removal spell. Yeah. And you just lose a lot of that flexibility because you're going to have to find a turn to pay 3 to get Lutree into your hand before you have that flexibility.
Yeah, my feeling when I see Lutree on the other side of the battlefield is always I have to get under them, right? I think you're very right in pegging Lutree companion decks as control decks because the raw card advantage that you know that deck can produce just based on basically starting with 9 cards if you assume that Lutree's going to copy something. But sometimes, if that's copying Cathartic Reunion or a Channeled Force, they're going to be up 2, 3, 4 cards on you. So if you let them get to that point, you're probably going to lose the game. But yeah, adding 3 mana somewhere along the road and limiting the flexibility that control deck has, I think, is a cost to this companion. The other card on our list here of medium impacted is Gigantha the Wellspring. Now, Gigantha wasn't super powerful or anything. Again, it just felt like a pretty easy card or low cost card to companion. Sometimes even you would splash it as your companion, just as a Miser's 8th card if you hit that 1 or 2 splash source. And now, again, the fact that you can't curve into this in a meaningful way. I mean, obviously, yes, if you find 3 mana on turn 3 or 4 along the way, if you just happen to have a sort of clunky hand, then it's fine. But it does feel a little bad that you can't go like 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop Gigantha. Not that was happening all the time, but I do think that's an impact on the card.
Right. I think that was happening less frequently than you would think. I mean, I think the way to think about Gigantha right now is 3/5/5 that's even more clunky than it was before.
Yeah, sure.
You have to pay 3. Like, I mean, you'll fit it in somewhere. It's up an extra card. It was very low cost to your deck. Like the cases I'm interested in for Gigantha are the ones where, like, you've got Vivian. Are you now still willing to companion Gigantha when you've got a Vivian? I don't know. I think probably yes.
That's really tough. Again, are you trying to mulligan to shuffle Vivian into your deck?
But now you got to add paying 3 to
But now you add paying 3, yeah. Right. I mean, this is we're all theory crafting here, right? Like, because we haven't I think we all came in too low on the companions in the beginning of the set. Like, oh yeah, maybe sometimes. Or like, well, that seems like big of a cost. And we just we're underrating how big being up a card was, or sometimes up more than one card in the instance of some of these. And now maybe we're overrating the cost of 3. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Gigantha is likely to be fine. I think my intention is that you're still probably supposed to companion it if you're giving up 1 good card. When it starts to get into like the 2 rare territory or like a really good rare and a removal spell, I'm less convinced that you should bend over to try to get Gigantha in your deck.
Yeah. All right. So those I think are our top 5. That's the top half of the companions, and now I think we're moving into territory of. I think you should probably now basically never companion. And I want to start with the one that I think is taking the biggest hit of all, which is Garuda the Macro Sage. So I think Garuda was a pretty contentious take, at least for me versus the field, I think. There's some data from 17lands.com that suggests that Garuda is like a pretty bad card to companion, that you're going to lose more often than not when you companion it, or your win rate goes down or whatever. My experience has been that this card is very powerful. Perhaps there's some differences between best of 1 and best of 3, which we addressed on the podcast. But now it's really hard to imagine being able to, because you can't do anything until turn 3. Now, when are you supposed to pay this 3 mana? Sometimes you just needed to go like 3-drop, 4-drop Garuda, maybe. Or, you're sort of like building out this board of like, all right, 3-drop and then 4-drop and then maybe a crystal and a 3-drop. And just when do you have the time to pay 3 mana to put Garuda into your hand?
I mean, I could see it. If you have a really good Garuda deck, I could see it, right? If you go, whatever, Frostlinks on 3 and then a really good blocker on 4. Mm-hmm. And then if you've got the shields up, I mean, theoretically, you'll have the time to do it, right?
Yeah.
If you clog the board. But there were a lot of games. You're just going to lose more games on the back of, like, your opponent swarms you now, right? Because the ones, like, having the option to cast a 5/4 on 5 was huge.
Yeah, that was very bad. A 5/4 on 5 that was, like, theoretically drawing you a card or 2 cards, depending on what you played previously and if it stuck around. So I'm very, very wary of Garuda. I think the tax impacts Garuda the most.
I mean, but I think you were hoping to not do that. Like, there were games I didn't play Garuda until, turn 9, turn 10, whatever. Like, but it was nice having that in case of emergency glass to break, right? And that's what's gone from Garuda.
Yes, I agree that Garuda I was often hoping to be the last card I played. But even then, a lot of the times, it was when you were on 7 mana and you were hoping to go Garuda, draw 4, play a land, play a 3-drop. And you can't do that now, right? Like, you have to have it. that turn you have to have 8 mana if you're trying to do it, or you have to have a turn previously where you're like, okay, pay 3, play a 3-drop, fingers crossed. But then like you're probably chumping or losing something along the way. I don't know. I'm a little wary here of Garuda.
I'm wary as well. I could see Garuda still potentially being companionable, but I think you should not probably go after it.
Yeah. And now next up are cards that this card I feel like is very, very much impacted. I think you should never companion this now. Umori the Collector. I had a deck yesterday with this that 7-2'd in best of 1 as a companion, but it had 3 Skull Prophets and a Humble Naturalist, right? The way this card is busted is Mana Dork on 2, Umori on 3, and then either like play a fatty on 4, like I was playing like Ivy Elementals as a 5/5 or whatever, or, dump 2 creatures at once. That's when you're going to win with this card, is when you're just like adding so much power and toughness to the board in such a quick fashion, and you just can't do that now.
Yep, agree. Never companion Umori.
How about Serta the Dawnwaker? This is one of the 3-drops we were talking about before that's probably going to be impacted because now you don't have the option like you used to just go, hey, I'm just going to play this on 3. Like, what's the point of jumping through the hoops of this card when the soonest it's coming down is turn 4, and that's after you've done nothing on turn 3? That just doesn't feel like there's any time for that or any space for that here.
Yeah, I agree. There were Zerta cycling decks, and it's possible to still get there for sure. But I mean, cycling's more and more contested these days, and giving up on Snare Tactician, Prickly Marmoset, and Reptilian Reflections a pretty big cost.
Yeah.
And I think you're probably just not willing to pay that cost anymore, is my guess. And then there's also the Zerta Brushwag deck, right? And that's certainly worse by not being able to go like Brushwag, Zerta on 3.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, I could see Zerta almost never getting companioned.
Yeah, I agree. And then bottom of the barrel here in our still terrible category. First up, which I think this card has actually gotten worse, is Kahira the Orphan Guard, which is already a card that's like really hard to jump through hoops. It was not a card I was interested in. Like, sure, you can first pick it, but not first picking with the idea of trying to companion it, just because I think this is much more of a card that like pack 2, you open it and you go, oh, I actually only lose out on like 1 card here. It's super awkward if you are trying to do the Vigilance deck because there are 2 humans, the Keensight Mentor and Alert Heatbonder, that are so important to that deck that you would never want to cut for this companion. But now again, one of the benefits of Kahira is you just like always have a 3-drop, and now you don't.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm bringing up the rear in the still terrible category that cracked me up when I saw it in the show notes, is Yorion, the Sky Nomad. Are you impressed that I knew that name?
I am. Well, there's no but so don't get cocky. But
oh,
yes.
Dang it. Yorion, Sky Nomad.
Yeah, so again, I think much like Garuda, this is impacted pretty significantly because, Yorion already most of the time, or like almost all the time, you shouldn't companion this because your deck's going to be too clunky. And now the fact that you have a clunky deck, but you can't curve out with this clunky deck. Already your deck's like playing a Sleeper Dart on 2 and maybe a Crystal on 3. And then when are you supposed to be able to play a 4-mana 4 or 5-mana 4/5 flyer? You can't do it on turn 5 now, or maybe you can, but like you're being pressured ideally or theoretically by your opponent pretty hard.
It's just not worth it. Never companion Yorion.
Yeah.
You weren't supposed to do it before, and adding 3 like at some other point before you get to cast the card, just don't do it.
Yeah. And then the last point that I wanted to make here before we sign off is that Memory Leak now can snag companions. And in a pretty like face-up way, you get to go, oh, you have a companion. Now I just wait for that turn where you pay 3 to put it into your hand, which in theory, most of the time is not going to be the same time you cast this companion, thinking about Garuda, for example. And then you just get to take it easy peasy.
I think Luris is probably the only one that really dodges Memory Leak, is my guess.
Yeah, but you can still, but then in those situations, much like in previous iterations, you can still at least grab it out of the graveyard before they corpse churn it or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Memory Leak got a huge bump and was already a great card.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything else. Like, the only other discard is like Cavern Whisperer, so no other like targeted discard that I can think of. But just a point that Memory Leak can now interact finally with companions in that way. So yeah. I think a pretty big shift it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the next few weeks, because I think the companions were sort of like, on par or slightly below the cycling decks in terms of like the raw power level and the quote unquote forcing you would do, opening companion, opening a Zenith Flare, and now a lot of them have been bumped down, I think.
I think I'm still on Luris as the best card in the set.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I'm still forcing Luris, still forcing Garuda, still close to forcing Obosh. Obosh a little less so. But yeah, I think a lot of them got a bump, and I agree that Luris is just still nutso.
And I think you're probably, when you say forcing, you're talking about from a pack one, pick one,
yeah, pack one,
right?
Pick one,
like
yes.
You're not doing the hard pivot probably anymore.
It depends. It depends what your pile looks like. But yeah, before I could see cutting. I could see cutting almost my entire pack one if I open Garuda pack two. If you're like, I got a lot of odd CMC cards, but this card is worth moving into. It's a little less so now, maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
So, interested to hear what other folks think. Please go ahead and leave us a comment in the comment section. Click that subscribe button, click the thumbs up button, and we will see you next time.
Catch you later.